Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voilet, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So, with Jedi Fallen Order, there was the video game, and then there was also a tie-in comic book series called Dark Temple, which was a little bit of the backstory of Seer Junda and her master who appears in the holograms in the game. The Jedi Survivor game was preceded by a tie-in novel, Battle Scars by Sam Maggs, and we talked about that on the podcast. Squadrons actually had its own fictional tie-ins as well, but I think they were kind of less known, and I just sort of stumbled across them actually. So there were two short stories that were written by Joanna Berry, who is credited as the main writer of Star Wars Squadrons. One of them is called Count to Three, and that one focuses on Titan Squadron, in particular Shen and Von Reg, two of the pilots from Titan Squadron that we meet in the video game. So this episode ends up being a quick breakdown of what happens in Count to Three, and I will link to it in the blog post for this show's episode at sw7x7.com and in the show notes as well. The story came out just a couple of weeks after the release of the game itself, so it wasn't necessarily a prequel in that particular sense, but you know, a tie-in for sure. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also point out that Battlefront and Battlefront 2 also had their own tie-in situations, right? Alexander Freed's Twilight Company novel and Christy Golden's Inferno Squad novel. For Squadrons, it's short stories, one of which focuses on Vanguard Squadron, the other on Titan Squadron, which is kind of fitting considering how the game works. So Count to Three is the Titan Squadron one. It focuses on Shen. It's sort of a third-person omniscient for him. That's the character in Squadrons who you never see with his helmet off because he's had so many injuries and been sort of rebuilt with various cybernetic stuff that he kind of needs his suit to be able to live, sort of a la Darth Vader-ish, if you will. And in classic Star Wars storytelling style, we find him in the middle of chaos. So he and this other pilot from the squadron, Von Reg, are on this Quasar-class cruiser called the Exigent. They're scouting ahead of a mission for Titan Squadron, but there's a missile attack that happens, and so the two of them are separated. They have to figure out what's going on, and they have to basically get off the ship, even though Shen has been injured. He's got a piece of Durasteel stuck in him, and yet because of the fact that he has dealt with pain so much over his life that he kind of figured out how to put it out of his mind, basically, and focus just on breathing, which is where the Count to Three title of the story comes from, just that he's counting his breathing situation. Inhale for 3, hold it for 3, exhale for 3, hold the exhale for 3, right? So that's how that ties in. Shen also, because of his cybernetics, is able to sense just how bad the damage to the Exigent is from the missile attack, based on the shuddering that the ship is doing, and tells Von Reg, we got to get out of here. We don't have time to save anyone. They manage to find a TIE Reaper and fly it out, and just in time because the reactor explodes on the ship and it just busts up into pieces. But they decide that they have to figure out why the Exigent was being attacked, because the Overseer is due to be in the system soon enough, and they're like, well, we can't have them show up and suddenly be under attack. Now, it turns out that they're able to track where the missiles came from. There's a space station nearby in the system, and so they make a daring run at the space station, just barely avoiding a missile lock that would have ended up taking them out. They get into the bay, and it turns out that the station had been a rebel station. It was taken over by Imperial cadets, or taken over by the Empire and staffed by cadets, but the cadets didn't have the sense enough, or their superiors didn't have sense enough, to reprogram all the missile system settings to not shoot at anything that was Imperial. So even though it is currently being run by the Empire, they weren't aware and didn't know how to turn it off so that it wouldn't continue firing at Imperial ships. Now, this makes Von Reg, the other pilot, who's a hothead to begin with, just extraordinarily angry, and she wants to take that anger out on those cadets. And Shen has to tell her, look, they're still our people, and they're going to have to live with what they've done, and we need to let them be, because ultimately they're part of the team that we need to get better to be able to defeat the Rebels or the New Republic or whatever they're calling themselves at this point. And there's another instance of the whole Count to Three business that shows up, because Shen is telling Von Reg to take a breath and not immediately react and take her anger at what happened out on these poor cadets. In her mind, they're responsible for 200 deaths, the crew complement of the Exigent. And yes, there are some who escaped. Escape pods went out and all of that, and they were wondering, well, how long is it before they start targeting the escape pods without even realizing it? So anyway, they end up, Shen and Von Reg, reprogramming the system so that they don't just automatically shoot at Empire targets anymore, and then take off. And that's pretty much the story of Count to Three. Once they get back to the Overseers, Shen goes to see the doctor to deal with the Durasteel thing sticking out of his clavicle area, and he's going to allow himself to just be patched up and not get retrofitted with like new equipment for his cybernetics and whatnot, because apparently this is now a supply issue for the Empire. But the doc is like, nope, we need everybody at full strength. And so even though, yeah, we're sort of running short on medical supplies, or now the supply lines for medical stuff are a little bit shaky, we're still going to completely get you up to tip-top shape so that way you can get back in the fray, which will be then flying in Star Wars Squadrons and tearing up the place. So that's the rundown on Count to Three, which is the Titan Squadron story by writer Joanna Barry from Star Wars Squadrons, and that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you dig the podcast, I hope you'll consider sharing it with other Star Wars fans that you know, whether in real life or on social media. I hope you consider leaving a rating or review on your favorite app, and I hope you'll also consider following, liking, subscribing, whatever the app likes to call it for you. I hope you'll consider doing that so that way you are sure to see Star Wars 7x7 show up in your feeds whenever you are ready for it. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the show, as always. And may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyrighted by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.